The New York Times, a former newspaper, has revealed a scandal of vast corruption at the New York Times, a former newspaper. Over the weekend, the Times ran a couple of stories trying to whitewash and explain away an FBI conspiracy to avenge the firing of incompetent sanctimony guy James Comey by investigating Donald Trump. The idea was to overturn the results of an election the FBI didn't like. What was presented as a bombshell by the Times was actually a cover-up in plain sight. It's hard to say which is worse, what the FBI leadership did in the name of political ideology, or a press that would cover up their attempt at a Keystone Cop coup. So the New York Times publishes this story on Friday, which is news dump time, right? They had another one on Saturday. It's a story about why the FBI started investigating Donald Trump. And what you have to see about this story is it's like the craziest conservative right-wing guy in his basement, hiding in his basement with a rifle, could not have come up with more of a deep state conspiracy. And yet the New York Times portrays it like your FBI. It's another exciting adventure of the FBI.
FBI.
Yes, the FBI taking the government of America into its own hands while the New York Times cheers them on. Here is the story. And again, remember, these are sources from the FBI and from the Democrats feeding stuff to the New York Times. Why? Why are they doing it? So that the New York Times can spin it to sound like it wasn't what it was, a deep state coup, essentially. FBI opened inquiry into whether Trump was secretly working on behalf of Russia. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense they go. But here it is. In the days after President Trump fired James Comey as FBI director, law enforcement officials became so concerned by the president's behavior that they began investigating whether he had been working on behalf of Russia against American interests, according to former law enforcement officials and others familiar with the investigation. So first of all, let's think about this for a minute. He fired this guy who's now been shown to be dishonest and incompetent, a leaker of material he leaked material to through a friend of his at Columbia in order to get a special counsel appointed, which worked. He bobbled the Hillary Clinton investigation, both by covering up for her, by excusing her when he had no business excusing her or not. He just was supposed to make a recommendation to the quietly sinister attorney general at the time. And instead he goes on TV. And then the Hillary Clinton people hated him because he came back and said, we're reopening this investigation. And she thinks that's one of the many millions of excuses she has for having lost the election. So the FBI decided that his behavior in firing James Comey, needed to be looked into. Okay, let's go back to the New York Times. The inquiry carried explosive implications. Counterintelligence investigators had to consider whether the president's own actions constituted a possible threat to national security. Agents also sought to determine whether Mr. Trump was knowingly working for Russia or had unwittingly fallen under Moscow's influence. The investigation the FBI opened into Mr. Trump also had a criminal aspect, which has long been publicly known, whether of his firing of Mr. Comey constituted obstruction of justice. Okay, again, we have to pause and think about this for a minute. First of all, there are two kinds of investigations the FBI does. They do counterintelligence investigations, which are not necessarily criminal and you don't need proof of a crime, but you need criminal investigations. You have to have a reason to suspect a crime has been committed. They did not start a criminal investigation, though they keep throwing this out there that they were looking into whether he obstructed justice. Here's the definition of obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice is an act that corruptly or by threats or force or by any threatening letter or communication influences, obstructs or impedes or endeavors to influence, obstruct or impede the due administration of justice. So in other words, you can't just obstruct justice by doing something legal. You have to be committing a crime in the obstruction of justice. So for instance, if I take the Fifth Amendment, if they're asking me questions about a crime they think I committed and I plead the Fifth because I don't want to incriminate myself, you can't then accuse me of obstructing justice by pleading the Fifth because I'm not doing anything illegal. I have to threaten people. I have to do something, use force, do something corrupt. That's what it says in the statute. Trump fired a guy who served at his pleasure. James Comey served at his pleasure. He had not only the absolute right to fire him, there was nothing to stand in his way. He could have fired him because he didn't like his tie. You're wearing a blue tie in a red tie administration. You're out of here, Comey. Nothing they could do about it. So there is no criminal investigation. It has to be illegal. Okay, back to the cover-up. The explosive bombshell report from the New York Times. If the president had fired Mr. Comey to stop the Russia investigation, the action would have been a national security issue because it naturally would have hurt the Bureau's effort to learn how Moscow interfered in the 2016 election and whether any Americans were involved, according to James A. Baker, who served as FBI general counsel until late 2017. He privately testified in October before House investigators who were examining the FBI's handling of the full Russia inquiry. And you'll notice that they have the transcript. This was a closed door testimony, but they and CNN have the transcript. So obviously, the guys in the FBI are leaking this stuff now before the Mueller report comes out in order to get the press to sell this to the public, to the gullible public, gullible people who read the New York Times, because it's only gullible people at this point read the New York Times, and me for the satire. They're selling this as a heroic thing that they did. This is the heroic FBI protecting your national security. Here's what Mr. Baker said. Not only would it be an issue of obstructing an investigation, but the obstruction itself, so that can't be true because he wasn't doing anything illegal, but the obstruction itself would hurt our ability to figure out what the Russians had done, and that is what would be the threat to national security. That is really twisted logic. That is extremely twisted logic that by firing a guy he had the absolute right to fire, that hampered the FBI's ability to do its job and find out what the Russians were doing. That is really twisted logic, and the New York Times is just selling it. Now, listen to this. No evidence has emerged publicly that Mr. Trump was secretly in contact with or took direction from Russian government officials. Guess what paragraph that is in the news story. That is the 9th paragraph. No evidence has emerged, and that's part of this story too. Why are they leaking it now? Because the Mueller investigation is probably winding down. He's probably going to issue a report. It sounds like it's going to say that there was no Russian collusion, which isn't even a crime to begin with. Here is John Karl from ABC. This is ABC, this is a full-on Democrat institution, right, with George Sokolopoulos as their lead news guy, this Clinton hack as a lead news guy who spent the Clinton election silencing women who were saying that Clinton had harassed them. He is now the lead news guy at ABC interviewing John Karl. And this is what Karl says his sources are telling him about the Mueller investigation.
What I am getting is that this is all building up to the Mueller report and raising expectations of a bombshell report. And there have been expectations that have been building, of course, for over a year on this. But people who are closest to what Mueller has been doing, who have interacted with the special counsel, caution me that this report is almost certain to be anticlimactic. That if you look at what the FBI was investigating in that New York Times report, you look at what they were investigating, Mueller did not go anywhere with that investigation. He has been writing his report in real time through these indictments, and we have seen nothing from Mueller on the central question of, was there any coordination, collusion with the Russians in the effort to meddle in the elections? Or was there even any knowledge on the part of the president or anybody in his campaign with what the Russians were doing?
They haven't laid that out yet in the indictments.
I was trying to shut him up. Yeah, well, wait, they haven't laid it out yet in the indictments. But what Karl is saying is you can follow what Mueller is doing through his indictments, and none of the indictments implicates Trump in any kind of, it's absurd that Trump is like a Russian spy. The whole thing is absurd. They were getting back at him for his firing of Comey. And, I've said this before, but I really do believe this. This is me speculating, but it just seems really clear. James Comey is a sanctimonious prig. He's a guy who thinks that he is the living avatar of American ethics and values. And meanwhile, he is clearly a left-wing, Democrat-supporting, deep state guy. They saw he and Andrew McCabe and Rod Rosenstein, too, who I think was a decent, prosecutor at some point. They saw this guy, Trump, coming down, and they panicked. They thought, who is this guy? He's not one of us. He's not one of the establishment. We have to protect the public. And this is in their minds. They're thinking, we are the guardians of the public. And so we are going to run out there and we're going to get rid of this guy. I mean, remember when Strzok and Page, the lovers, were sending back those texts, and they said, we need an insurance policy in case the impossible happens and Trump wins the election. And he did win the election, and they panicked. They panicked because they were surrounded by people who agreed with them. They were in an administration that had convinced itself it was God's gift to America. It was sent from heaven to move this country to the left, to move this country into globalization, to move this country into a place where the elites could run it and the people would just get their kind of every now and again. We'd sort of hear from them, but they wouldn't bother anybody. They thought they were sent, by heaven to guide this country on the Obama path. And suddenly this bowling ball of a Donald Trump comes rolling down the alley at them. And they thought, oh my gosh, we have to rush to the barricades to protect America from the voice of the people. That's basically what it was. If you want to hear, this is the key paragraph in this New York Times story. If you want to hear the logic here and why it's so appalling, and why it's so appalling that our press, a former newspaper like the New York Times would have so forgotten what it means to be a newspaper that they would let these unelected bureaucrats in power take on an elected official like this without any real motive. Here's what they say. Mr. Trump, this is an amazing paragraph. Mr. Trump had caught the attention of FBI counterintelligence agencies when he called on Russia during a campaign news conference in July 2016 to hack into the emails of his opponent, Hillary Clinton. It's the first part of the paragraph. Let's stop right there. First of all, the Trump remark was clearly a Trumpian, what would you call it? He was trolling them. But there was no possibility of the Russians hacking in to Hillary Clinton's emails because she had already destroyed her server. Remember the 33,000 emails that vanished because she was pouring bleach bit on her server and then hammering the phones with the hammers until, but they were just about yoga. Those emails were just about yoga. They're about, this guy's just going to hammer it and pour the bleach bit. It's just about yoga, just about more beat and hammer. That's what he was talking about. And what he was saying is, hey, if the Russians got him, great, let the Russians bring him forward. But this was looked upon, it was one of those things where the scandal of what Hillary Clinton had done was so bad and so obvious to everybody that they had to create a scandal by being shocked, so shocked, that Donald Trump called upon the Russians to, quote, unquote, hack into Hillary Clinton's emails. There was nothing to hack into. It was all destroyed. She had ditched it all, which Comey helped her cover up, helped her get away with. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing, Mr. Trump had refused to criticize Russia on the campaign trail, praising President Vladimir Putin. Now think about this for a minute. The FBI was alerted. This is the first part of this paragraph. FBI counterintelligence agents, right? Trump caught the attention of FBI counterintelligence agents when he refused to criticize Russia on the campaign trail, praising Vladimir Putin. Think about this for a minute. Trump, as he repeatedly said it would be a good thing if me and Putin could get along. That was his repeated line. He said it over and over again. That was his foreign policy. That was what his foreign policy was going to be. It would be good if we could make amends with Russia. I didn't agree with that. I think Putin's a gangster. I don't think you can get along with him. But the president has the right to make foreign policy. This is in Article 2 of the Constitution. The Supreme Court has again and again called it a plenary. He has a plenary right, which means a complete right to go and talk to the leaders of other countries and arrange, deals and negotiate with them. He has a complete plenary right to do this. What business is it of the FBI what his policy is? How does that come under their power? How does that come under the FBI's power? What if? I mean, all you have to do is turn it around. Barack Obama dealt with Iran. He basically set Iran up to be the powerhouse in the Middle East, the chief sponsor of terror throughout the world, an awful country that is sworn to wipe Israel off the face of the map. Barack Obama said, we should stop dealing with Saudi Arabia and deal with Iran. That'll be a really good idea. He was a clown. That was a clownish, stupid, ignorant thing to do based on this kind of pie-in-the-sky professorial academic theory that Obama had that had nothing to do with the real world. But the FBI didn't say, oh, we've got to investigate him. He may be dealing with Iran. He was dropping money into Iran. The FBI didn't investigate that. But because on the campaign trail, Donald Trump said, I think we should talk to Putin. They thought, we have to start a counterintelligence investigation to investigate Russia's ties. And finally, this is amazing. This is an amazing thing. This is a true scandal at the FBI. That's why everybody there has been fired. And the New York Times is covering it up in plain sight by printing the story as if it were a good thing. They're actually engaging in a cover-up. Investigators had watched with alarm as the Republican Party softened its convention platform on the Ukraine crisis in a way that seemed to benefit Russia. Never happened. Byron York reported on this at what's his place called? The Examiner. That they did, as they always, change the platform. They changed it a little bit. It only got tougher. They never took out the original language, which was something like, we will meet the return of Russian belligerents with the same resolve that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was the original language. All that language stayed in. Then someone else tried to add an amendment, and they did fiddle with the amendment, not to make it less harsh, but simply to make it give Trump more latitude in negotiating. And in the end, writes Byron York, nothing was taken out of the party's original draft platform at Russia. And with Trump's approval, the platform was made tougher with language pledging ongoing and possibly increased sanctions. So that is just not true. It's just not true. But of course, if the FBI tells it to the New York Times, they've got to run with it. This is an amazing piece of journalism as cover-up. It's a dual scandal. It's a scandal that the FBI took this power onto itself, and that scandal has been dealt with by all these people getting fired, although Comey, I think, really might well be put in jail. He should be put in jail, but I don't think that's going to happen. But it's also a scandal of journalism. It is a scandal that the New York Times would turn to this organization, which again and again has been caught abusing its power throughout time, and write this as if it were another episode of the FBI. And then Trump comes out, and Gene Pirro goes on a friendly show, and Gene Pirro asks him if he is a Russian spy. Here, let's play a little bit of this.
The investigation was whether you were actively working for Russia or unwittingly. So I'm going to ask you, are you now, or have you ever worked for Russia, Mr. President?
I think it's the most insulting thing I've ever been asked. I think it's the most insulting article I've ever had written. And if you read the article, you'd see that they found absolutely nothing. But
so how do you think the press covered that? Guess. When he said that's the most insulting thing. Trump refuses to deny he was a Russian agent. That was the headline, not just, it was all over the place. That was Trump evading the question. So if Trump came out today and he put paid to that version of the story, here he is.
I never worked for Russia, and you know that answer better than anybody. I never worked for Russia. Not only did I never work for Russia, I think it's a disgrace that you even asked that question, because it's a whole big fat hoax. It's just a hoax.
So that takes care of that version of the story. In the midterms, we saw that the rich, the wealthier suburbs and the wealthier cities voted for the Democrats. Hillary Clinton made that brag when she was in Mumbai. She said, the places that are economically dynamic voted for me. It was all those backward places where they're dying of opiate addiction that's the red zone where they voted for Donald Trump. The Democrats have become the party of the elite, and journalism has become a practice of the elite. And what we are seeing is the elite working with what they now call the deep state. And in this case, that term is justified. We've seen the elite working with the deep state to keep the elite elite. And for all the stuff they're talking about, we have women now, and we have black people, and we're the party of diversity. They are the party of the rich. They are the party of the elite. It is the Republicans who are now talking about the little guy, about the ordinary American. They have switched places in this case. And I think it is pitiful and pathetic that journalism should now become a way. They always used to say what was journalism was a way of comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. They have now turned that around. It's a way of comforting the comfortable and afflicting the afflicted. This story is a shame on the New York Times.